On August 18, 2025, Captain Ibrahim Traoré pulled off what he calls a historic act. He ordered the entire United States Embassy to leave Burkina Faso. Not just the ambassador, not a few staff, everyone. The stars and stripes came down, the embassy doors closed, and the country celebrated what state TV called the end of humiliation. Of course, this is the same Burkina Faso, where over 40% of the national budget comes from foreign aid. So perhaps the only thing more historic than Traoré's order will be the hunger lines that follow it. To his supporters, it was courage. To his critics, it looked more like a reckless dare. Think about it. A landlocked country already struggling with 2.2 million displaced people and 2,000 civilian deaths last year just told its biggest donor to get lost. Some call it sovereignty, others call it national cosplay, acting independent while still desperately dependent on outside money. Even in Washington, diplomats were stunned. One official reportedly muttered, "You don't usually bite the hand that feeds you, at least not while still chewing." Now I want to hear from you. Is this bravery or foolishness? Do you see a leader making history or a politician gambling with his people's survival? In the U.S., media outlets like CNN labeled it diplomatic suicide. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, murals went up overnight declaring sovereignty is not for sale. Two opposite reactions, one dramatic headline. Comment below with your take, and don't forget to like and share if you think stories like this deserve real debate. Transition. But what exactly set Traoré off? What drove him to risk food shortages, medicine gaps, and diplomatic isolation just to make a point? To understand, we need to look at the spark that lit this fire. A single American report that turned paperwork into outrage. The embassy expulsion wasn't triggered by bombs, sanctions, or foreign soldiers. No, it was triggered by paper. In August 2025, Washington released a report that placed Burkina Faso's armed forces in the same category as extremist groups operating in the Sahel. To U.S. officials, it was standard language, bureaucratic jargon meant for policymakers. But in Ouagadougou, the document landed like a slap across the face. For Captain Traoré, it wasn't analysis, it was insult. His ministers say he read the pages out loud, line by line, slamming the table with frustration. Now let's pause. The irony here is brutal. Burkina Faso's army has suffered over 1,000 fatalities since 2016, fighting jihadist groups, and the country has buried thousands of civilians killed in terrorist raids. But the same army has also been accused by NGOs of extrajudicial killings, village raids, and torture. So when Washington called them violators, was it arrogance, or was it inconvenient truth? That's the uncomfortable part nobody wants to talk about. Traoré's government reacted by going on national television. State broadcasters told citizens, "America has labeled our soldiers criminals." In barracks, soldiers clenched their fists. Some muttered, "We bled in Djibo, we fought in Yaga, and they dare compare us to Al-Qaeda." Here again, reality is complicated. Yes, soldiers fight jihadists, but human rights groups have documented mass graves linked to army operations. When you live in a war zone, lines blur, and that blur is what Washington highlighted. Traoré, of course, took the easy path. Frame it as pure arrogance. Now here's the question to you. If a foreign report accused your army of war crimes, would you see it as a wake-up call or an insult to national honor? In the U.S., Pentagon officials brushed it off, calling the assessment fact-based and routine. But in Burkina Faso, those words were enough to spark rage on the streets. Comment your view right now, arrogance or accuracy, and if you think the truth is never that simple, hit like and share this story. From that moment, the decision was no longer about aid, budgets, or poor. Traoré had turned it into a narrative war, one where every word from Washington was ammunition. The next step was obvious. Strip away the symbols of dependency, starting with the flag flying above the U.S. Embassy. If there is one thing Burkina Faso has in abundance, it's speeches about dignity. What it doesn't have in abundance? Food, medicine, and cash. By 2024, Burkina Faso was receiving over $115 million per year from the United States alone, mostly for healthcare, education, and food security. According to the World Bank, foreign assistance covered more than 40% of the country's budget. That means almost half of what the state spends on its citizens comes not from local revenue, but from the generosity, or depending on how you see it, the strings, of outsiders. In fact, the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, proudly reported it had funded over 700 schools and clinics in Burkina Faso since 2010. But Traoré brushed all this aside, declaring that aid without dignity is a chain. Now, it's one thing to speak about pride when your economy is thriving. It's another when the average Burkinabe survives on less than $900 per year. According to the UN, more than 40% of the population lives below the poverty line, and 3.3 million people were already in need of urgent humanitarian aid before this crisis began. So when Traoré says, "Better hunger in freedom than bread in humiliation," one might ask, easy for him to say, while eating 3 meals at the presidential palace. Here's a comparison worth making. In Ethiopia, a country with its own conflicts, leaders swallowed their pride and still negotiated to keep Western aid flowing because they knew famine would undermine everything else. In contrast, Burkina Faso is taking the gamble of becoming the first aid-dependent nation to deliberately kick its donors out. As one American analyst told Foreign Policy magazine, "This isn't sovereignty, this is playing Russian roulette with your population." So let's ask the obvious. Is dignity worth more than survival? Would you trade vaccines, classrooms, and grain shipments for a slogan? In Washington, the State Department calls aid partnership. In Ouagadougou, officials now call it blackmail. And in reality, the people who will feel the difference are not diplomats. It's the mothers in rural markets and the children in overcrowded schools. If you think Traoré is gambling with his people's lives, say it in the comments. If you think he's right to choose pride over dependency, hit like and share this video, because this is a debate the world needs to hear. And so with pride loudly declared and dependency dismissed as slavery, Traoré moved to the next act in his defiance, making the world watch as the U.S. flag was lowered and a new chapter of Burkina Faso's isolation began. When Traoré slammed the door on Washington, the world didn't just watch. It scrambled to spin the story to its own advantage. In Washington, the reaction was immediate. The State Department threatened to cut more than $100 million in annual U.S. assistance, money that supported everything from malaria treatment to food security. American officials framed Traoré's move as reckless and irresponsible, warning that Burkina Faso's government was essentially writing a death sentence for its most vulnerable citizens. Behind the scenes, policymakers debated whether to suspend even counterterrorism cooperation, the very programs that had kept Burkinabe forces supplied with equipment and training against jihadist groups. Paris wasn't far behind. Still haunted by its military withdrawal from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in 2023, France panicked about losing its last traces of influence in the Sahel. French newspapers accused Traoré of playing with fire, calling him a gambler lighting a match in a powder keg. One defense analyst put it bluntly, "If Burkina Faso cuts ties completely, Europe has zero leverage left in the region." To put it simply, France sees Traoré less as a freedom fighter and more as an arsonist. Then came Moscow. Russia's state television suddenly discovered its new African hero. Commentators called Traoré a lion of sovereignty, while Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov praised him as proof Africa will no longer bow to neo-colonial dictates. Conveniently, Russian envoys also arrived with offers of weapons and military trainers, because nothing says independence like swapping one flag for another's boots. So here's the question. Is this about sovereignty or about choosing a different sponsor? In the United States, analysts warned that Traoré was opening the door to new dependency under Russia and possibly China. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, state media presented it as global recognition of their bravery. What do you think? Is Traoré rewriting the rules or just auditioning for a new master? Comment your view, and if you think this debate matters, share and subscribe so more people hear it. Meanwhile, Beijing played its favorite role: silent but opportunistic. Officially, the Chinese Foreign Ministry said little. Unofficially, Chinese envoys landed in Ouagadougou days later with offers of grain shipments and infrastructure loans. Their line was simple: we don't interfere, we only partner. Translation: we'll take the contracts the West just lost. Turkey, too, rushed in. Ankara announced it was prepared to expand hospitals and schools across the Sahel, declaring Burkina Faso a brother, a bridge, and a partner in faith. In the end, every global player had its script. Washington saw recklessness. Paris saw collapse. Moscow saw opportunity. Beijing saw business. Ankara saw religion. And Traoré? He saw cameras. But behind all this diplomatic theater, ordinary Burkinabe were left asking the only question that really mattered: what happens to us? While diplomats made speeches abroad, Ouagadougou's streets turned into a stage show: loud chants, painted walls, and a whole lot of symbolism. Crowds gathered outside the U.S. Embassy as Marines lowered the stars and stripes. Supporters of Traoré roared, "Sovereignty is not for sale!" Women ululated, students waved Burkinabe flags, and state TV called it a historic moment of liberation. One mural went up within hours, the American flag being pulled down, while the green and red AES banner climbed skyward. Beneath it, in giant letters, "Our story, our pen." For government supporters, it was proof that Burkina Faso had seized control of its narrative. For critics, it was spray paint standing in for policy. But while murals multiplied, so did worries. At the Grand Marché in Ouagadougou, prices for rice and cooking oil jumped within a week of the embassy closure. Traders admitted they were anxious. U.S. aid programs had quietly supported food imports for years. Doctors at Ouagadougou Hospital told reporters they were rationing antibiotics, with supplies expected to run out within 2 months if new shipments didn't arrive. In Kaya and Dori, displaced families asked bluntly whether aid workers would disappear with the diplomats. In other words, while slogans painted walls, shortages threatened stomachs. Now ask yourself, can sovereignty pay hospital bills? Can a slogan replace food on the table? In the U.S., commentators on MSNBC mocked the murals, saying, "You can't cook graffiti into a meal." But in Ouagadougou, government spokesmen insisted that pride would sustain the people longer than American grain. Two very different perspectives, one hard question. If you think pride is worth the pain, type dignity in the comments. If you think slogans don't feed children, type reality. And don't forget to like and share so others can join this debate. Of course, even the government couldn't ignore the tension. Ministers admitted privately that over 3.3 million Burkinabe were already in need of urgent humanitarian assistance before the U.S. departure. Schools had shut down in rural areas because funding dried up, with 6,000 classrooms closed due to insecurity and lack of resources. Yet the official line never wavered. Hunger was a price worth paying, because dependency was worse than poverty. One veteran standing outside the embassy summed it up with a line that state TV repeated endlessly: "We bury not America, but arrogance itself." Fine words, but they won't fill school desks or pharmacy shelves, and so the capital burned with pride, while kitchens went empty. Traoré had framed the moment as a moral battle between dignity and dependency. But as the shortages deepened, that battle turned into something sharper, a moral dilemma pitting the stomach against the soul. Pride sounds inspiring on television, but it doesn't taste very good when served for dinner. By September 2025, aid agencies warned that over 600,000 Burkinabe in rural areas were at risk of malnutrition within months if food imports slowed. The U.S. had been contributing roughly $13 million annually to malaria programs, money that purchased bed nets, medicine, and staff training. Without it, doctors predicted rising infection rates in the next rainy season. UNICEF noted that nearly 1 in 3 children in Burkina Faso already suffered from stunted growth due to poor nutrition. Now, with supplies disrupted, the numbers could only get worse. At a camp near Kaya, families displaced by jihadist attacks lined up for food rations that no longer arrived daily. A local aid worker admitted, "We are stretching one day's rice into 3. In a televised visit, Traoré knelt beside a child who asked, "Captain, will we have food?" His answer, "Maybe less food today, but more freedom tomorrow." State TV called it inspirational. Critics called it delusional. After all, malaria parasites don't wait politely for freedom to ripen. Meanwhile, in Washington, senators grilled Africa analysts in committee hearings. One lawmaker put it bluntly, "You can't eat dignity. Children can't survive on slogans." American media hammered the point. The New York Times editorial board described Traoré's decision as nationalist theater with deadly consequences. CNN anchors reminded viewers that Burkina Faso is among the top 5 poorest nations in the world, with GDP per capita barely $900. Yet here was its leader, telling people to swallow pride instead of protein. Let's make it personal. If your child's vaccine program was halted because your leader wanted to prove a point, would you clap or would you curse? Would you trade medicine for speeches? In Ouagadougou, the government spun it as sacrifice for sovereignty. In New York and Paris, it looked like reckless endangerment of human life. Which side makes sense to you? Comment food if you think survival comes first. Comment freedom if you think dignity is worth hunger. And don't forget to like and share, because this debate isn't abstract, it's about real stomachs and real graves. The hunger crisis highlighted the core contradiction. Traoré called it independence. The West called it self-destruction. But across Africa, other leaders were watching closely, asking themselves, was this courage contagious, or just a contagious disaster? That question would lead directly to the regional domino effect. Traoré's gamble wasn't just about Burkina Faso. Very quickly, his neighbors started flirting with the same dangerous idea, because nothing spreads faster in politics than a bad example. In Bamako, Mali's interim government praised the embassy expulsion, calling it a victory for sovereignty. Niger's junta followed suit, announcing expanded cooperation under the AES alliance, the military pact linking Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso since 2023. By late September 2025, the 3 juntas staged joint border patrols and new military drills, proudly showing off unity without Western oversight. Supporters called it the Sahel Rising. Critics called it 3 bankrupt regimes tying their broken economies together with string and calling it rope. The ripple effects worried Western capitals. In Paris, editorials warned of a Sahel domino effect, where rejection of Western aid and influence could spread to Senegal, Chad, or even Guinea. French defense analysts described Traoré's move as cutting the last rope connecting the Sahel to Europe. In Washington, congressional hearings turned urgent. One senator asked, "If Burkina Faso can dismiss us, how many others will follow? And what happens when Russia fills the gap?" The fear was clear, a Cold War sequel, but this time staged in the Sahel's deserts. Here's the irony. While Traoré claimed he was rejecting dependency, Russian state TV rolled out wall-to-wall coverage, celebrating him as a young lion of Africa. Lavrov praised the move as proof Africa is free. Meanwhile, Russian envoys offered more weapons and training, because apparently dependency magically transforms into sovereignty the moment it switches brands. Turkey chimed in too, promising new hospitals and schools. And China. True to form, it stayed quiet in public but sent envoys with grain shipments and infrastructure credit lines. Independence, it seems, now comes with an invoice from Beijing. Now, what do you think? Is this the start of a real African coalition, or just group therapy for juntas who need each other to look legitimate? In America, Rand Corporation analysts warned this was geopolitical theater with real humanitarian risks. In Ouagadougou, state media spun it as the dawn of a new era. Who's right? Comment below. And if you think the domino effect is just political fantasy, share this video so the spin stops here. And so the stage expanded from one embassy in Ouagadougou to an entire region. But while politicians traded statements and foreign powers jockeyed for influence, The question refused to go away. When the rice runs out and the medicine expires, will sovereignty still taste sweet? That brings us to the final, unavoidable question. After all the speeches, chants, and flag-waving, Burkina Faso is left with the simplest and cruelest question. What now? On August 19, 2025, the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou closed with a thud. Convoys of black SUVs rolled out, Marines folded the stars and stripes, and for the first time in decades, America had no diplomatic foothold in Burkina Faso. State TV called it the burial of arrogance. But to humanitarian agencies, it looked more like the burial of food programs. By September, aid groups warned that over 600,000 people in rural provinces faced malnutrition if grain shipments didn't resume. Vaccine campaigns had already slowed, jeopardizing the health of thousands of children. The U.S. had funded nearly $13 million in malaria prevention annually, money that vanished overnight. Traoré framed it differently. From the balcony of the presidential palace, he declared, "We are not expelling a building, we are expelling arrogance." Stirring words, but reality bites harder. According to the UN, 3.3 million Burkinabés already required urgent humanitarian aid before the expulsion. Now that figure is expected to rise. Pride is powerful, yes, but it cannot substitute for antibiotics. From Washington, commentators doubled down. The New York Times called the decision nationalist theater with deadly consequences. CNN anchors asked, "What good is freedom if your children starve?" In contrast, Russia praised, Turkey promised hospitals, and China offered grain, which means Burkina Faso might have simply swapped one dependency for three. Independence, it seems, always comes with a bill. So here's the question for you. Is Traoré a bold visionary, or just a reckless gambler playing with other people's hunger? Was this the first step toward an Africa that finally writes its own story, or the opening chapter of another crisis that ends with new masters? Comment below. Type dignity if you think pride comes first, or survival if you think food comes first. And don't just watch, share this video, subscribe, and bring more voices into the debate. Because this isn't just about Burkina Faso, it's about whether nations can really live on sovereignty alone. And so the embassy is gone, the murals are painted, the slogans are shouted. But when the rice runs out and the medicine shelves go empty, history will ask only one thing. Was this liberation, or just hunger with better branding?